Officer Steve Hayes sat in his patrol car, the low hum of the engine vibrating through the seat as he drummed his fingers impatiently on the steering wheel. The shift had been dull, just like every other night in this part of the city. No real action, no excitement, just the usual rounds in a neighborhood he had long since deemed a lost cause. He sighed heavily, glancing out at the rows of dimly lit streets lined with decaying buildings and shuttered storefronts. He didn't want to be here, he never did. In his mind, this was the kind of place that bred trouble run down, full of people who didn't seem to care about improving their lives, always blaming others for their problems. His breath hissed through his teeth as he glanced at the clock on his dashboard. 3 more hours before his shift ended, and there was nothing to break the monotony. As he cruised past the closed corner store, a figure caught his eye. A middle-aged woman stood just outside the door, hunched over slightly, holding a plastic grocery bag in one hand and a cane in the other. She was wearing an oversized coat that swallowed her small frame and a wide-brimmed hat that cast her face in shadow. To Steve, she looked out of place, too old to be out this late, too suspicious to be standing there for no apparent reason. He narrowed his eyes, questioning what she was doing at this hour. Something about her unsettled him. Steve had long ago developed a sense for trouble, or at least what he thought was trouble, and this woman fit the profile. Loitering, probably homeless, or worse, maybe involved in something illegal. It didn't matter that she looked frail. He knew from experience that appearances could be deceiving. He pulled the squad car to a stop across the street, his gaze fixed on her slow, deliberate movements. She wasn't doing anything, just standing there, occasionally shifting her weight from one leg to the other, but that was enough in Steve's mind. She didn't need to be doing something to warrant his suspicion. Her mere presence in the middle of the night in this neighborhood was reason enough. Steve exhaled through his nose, tightening his grip on the steering wheel, his pulse quickening not from fear, but from the anticipation of asserting his authority. He liked these moments, the feeling of power that came with being able to command respect or at least force it out of people. This woman, standing there as if she had all the time in the world, was about to be reminded of where she was and who was in charge. He put the car in park and swung the door open, the sound of his boots hitting the pavement punctuating the stillness of the night. As he crossed the street, he noticed how the woman barely reacted to his approach. She wasn't nervous, wasn't fidgeting like most people did when they saw a cop walking toward them. That irritated him. "Hey!" Steve called out, his voice cutting through the quiet. The woman turned her head slowly, her eyes barely visible beneath the brim of her hat. She didn't speak, didn't flinch, and that only fueled his irritation further. He closed the distance between them in a few strides, coming to stand just a couple of feet in front of her. Up close, she looked even older than he had first thought. Her skin was wrinkled, her hands thin and bony, her clothes second-hand, the kind of worn-out stuff that told him she didn't have much. "What are you doing here?" Steve demanded, his voice sharp and authoritative. He expected an answer right away, but the woman simply blinked at him, her expression calm, almost serene. She didn't seem intimidated, and that set Steve on edge. "I asked you a question," he said, stepping closer, his posture straightening as he tried to impose his presence on her. "You got ID?" The woman remained silent for a moment, her eyes studying him in a way that made him uncomfortable. Then, finally, she spoke, her voice soft but firm. "I haven't done anything wrong, officer. I'm just on my way home." Steve scoffed, his lips curling into a sneer. "Home? It's after midnight. You shouldn't be out here loitering like this. What's in the bag?" The woman glanced down at the plastic bag she held loosely in her hand. "Just some groceries," she said evenly, lifting it slightly as if to show there was nothing suspicious inside. Steve didn't care. Her calmness and refusal to be rattled were getting under his skin. He had dealt with all kinds of people in his career, most knew better than to argue with a cop, especially in this part of town. But this woman? She wasn't playing by the rules. She wasn't scared, and that made him want to push harder. "Show me what's inside," he ordered, his voice dropping lower, more menacing now. The woman sighed, a tired expression crossing her face, but she didn't argue. She slowly lifted the bag, showing him a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and some canned goods. Nothing out of the ordinary, but Steve wasn't satisfied. He had expected more drugs, stolen items, anything that would justify the suspicion bubbling in his chest. Finding nothing only made him more agitated. "That's all you're carrying?" he asked, his voice dripping with disbelief. He glanced around the street, making sure no one else was watching, though he could feel the eyes of a few passers-by lingering in the shadows. The woman nodded, saying nothing further. Steve could feel his control over the situation slipping away, and it infuriated him. He needed to assert dominance, to remind her and himself who was in charge. His mind raced, searching for something, anything to escalate the situation. "Let me see your ID," he demanded again, more forcefully this time. The woman's expression didn't change. She slowly reached into her coat, her movements deliberate, cautious. She pulled out a worn wallet and handed him her ID without a word. Steve snatched it from her hand, glancing at the name and address. Lisa Collins, a local address, nothing suspicious, but that didn't matter to him. He could feel control of the situation slipping, and it gnawed at his ego. He handed the ID back to her with a sharp flick of his wrist, his eyes narrowing. "Why are you out here, really?" he asked, leaning closer, his voice dropping into a near growl. "I don't buy your story. What's the real reason you're hanging around this neighborhood at this hour?" Lisa looked him straight in the eye, unflinching. "I told you the truth, officer. I'm just trying to get home. There's no need to treat me like a criminal." The calmness in her voice, the steady gaze, it was too much. Steve's face flushed with anger. How dare she act as though she wasn't intimidated by him? How dare she challenge his authority? Even with her polite words and soft tone, he wasn't about to let her walk away unscathed. "Lady," he spat, stepping closer so they were almost chest to chest, "you don't tell me what I need to do. You're in the wrong place at the wrong time, and I'm going to make sure you understand that." The tension in the air was thick now, the silence of the street amplifying the exchange between them. Steve's heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline coursing through his veins. This woman, this old, fragile-looking woman, had somehow gotten under his skin, and he wasn't sure why. All he knew was that he needed to regain control, to assert his authority before the situation slipped entirely out of his hands. The air felt heavier as Officer Steve Hayes stood towering over Lisa, his chest rising and falling in shallow, frustrated breaths. He couldn't understand how this elderly woman, so small and seemingly frail, could remain so composed in the face of his authority. He was used to people quaking at the sight of his uniform, especially in this neighborhood, but she wasn't like the others, and that unnerved him. The street around them remained eerily quiet, the occasional distant sound of a car engine or muffled conversation drifting through the air. A few pedestrians had passed by, quickening their pace when they saw the confrontation, afraid to be caught in the middle of whatever was about to unfold. The yellow light from the street lamps cast long, warped shadows over the cracked pavement, giving the scene an unsettling feeling, as though it were taking place in some distorted dream. Steve was seething every second that Lisa stood there, calm and steady, was another blow to his ego. He could feel his patience wearing thin, his control slipping through his fingers like water. His hands twitched at his sides, fingers itching to make some kind of move, something that would force her to react the way he expected, fearful, obedient, submissive. But she just stood there, her cane held loosely in one hand, her eyes locked onto his with an expression he couldn't read. It wasn't defiance exactly, but it wasn't fear either, it was confidence. That's what made it worse. She was confident, even in the face of his authority, and that was a problem. "You're not from around here, are you?" Steve spat, taking another step closer, his face inches from hers now, his breath hot, laced with the coffee he had been drinking all night to keep himself awake. Lisa didn't flinch. "I've lived in this neighborhood longer than you've been an officer," she replied evenly, her voice soft yet firm. "I know these streets better than most. Steve gritted his teeth. That wasn't the answer he wanted. He wanted her to falter, to show some sign that she was scared of him, that she recognized his power. But she didn't. She spoke as though she had nothing to fear, as though she were the one in control, and that was unacceptable. Then you should know better than to stand out here in the middle of the night, he growled. You know what happens around here, don't you? It's not safe, not for someone like you. Lisa's gaze didn't waver. I've seen worse things than you could imagine, officer. Standing outside a closed store isn't one of them. Her words stung, though Steve didn't fully understand why. Maybe it was the way she said them, so calm and collected, as though she had nothing to prove. It only made his blood boil more. He took another step forward, so close now that their shoes nearly touched. He could see the fine lines in her face, the silver strands of hair escaping from beneath her wide-brimmed hat. She looked tired, but not vulnerable, and that made him furious. Let me tell you something, lady, he said, his voice low, filled with barely restrained anger. You don't get to talk to me like that. You don't get to stand here and act like you're above the rules. You don't get to disrespect me. Lisa tilted her head slightly, her lips pressing together in a thoughtful line. She looked at him, really looked at him, as though she were trying to figure him out, to peel back the layers of his anger and find something deeper. Her silence made Steve even more uncomfortable, as though she could see right through him, past the uniform, past the badge, into something he didn't want to acknowledge. I'm not disrespecting you, officer, she said quietly after a long pause. I'm just not afraid of you. That did it? Steve's vision blurred with rage, his jaw clenching so hard that it hurt. How dare she? How dare this old woman stand there and say that to him, a police officer? It wasn't just an insult to him, it was an insult to everything he represented, everything he stood for. He had the authority, not her. She was supposed to fear him, she was supposed to respect him. That was how things worked. You should be, he hissed, his voice barely more than a whisper now, his hand twitching near his belt, where his flashlight hung a silent threat. You don't know who you're messing with. Lisa's eyes flicked down briefly, noticing the movement of his hand, but she didn't back away. She didn't even blink. You don't know who you're talking to, Officer Hayes, she said softly. Steve's stomach twisted. Something about the way she said his name, his full name, sent a jolt of unease through him. How did she know his name? He hadn't introduced himself. The realization hit him like a slap in the face, but he quickly shoved it aside. She could have seen his name tag, he reasoned. That was all there was. No way she knew anything about him. But that brief moment of doubt, that small seed of fear, planted itself in the back of his mind, gnawing at him as he stood there, trying to maintain his composure. He couldn't let her see it, he couldn't let her win. You think you're smart, don't you? He spat, the venom in his words barely concealed. You think you can just stand here and talk to me like that, like you're better than me? I never said that, Lisa replied, her voice still calm, still infuriatingly steady. I'm just trying to get home. Steve snapped, stepping even closer until there was almost no space between them. You're lying. I know you are. I can see it in your eyes. Lisa's gaze didn't falter. And what do you see in my eyes? Steve opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time in the encounter, he found himself at a loss. What did he see in her eyes? He didn't know. All he knew was that she wasn't reacting the way she should be. She wasn't scared, and that was throwing him off. It made him feel small, powerless, as though his badge, his uniform meant nothing in this moment, and that was the most dangerous feeling of all. Listen, he said, his voice trembling slightly now, betraying the anger that simmered just beneath the surface. You don't get to walk away from this, not after disrespecting me like that. You're going to learn your place, and I'm going to make sure you do. Lisa remained silent, her eyes locked on his, watching him carefully. She wasn't challenging him, at least not overly, but her calmness, her refusal to bow to his authority was a challenge in itself, and Steve didn't know how to handle it. Why are you doing this? He demanded, his voice rising with frustration. Why are you acting like you're untouchable? You're not. I can arrest you right now, and no one would care. You could, Lisa replied quietly. But would that make you feel better, Officer Hayes? The question took him by surprise, his fists clenched at his sides, his knuckles turning white as he tried to suppress the urge to lash out. How could she remain so calm? How could she stand there in the face of his growing rage and still ask him that question? Steve's heart pounded in his chest, his pulse racing as the seconds stretched into what felt like hours. He wanted to do something, anything that would break her composure, that would make her react the way he expected her to. But nothing he said, nothing he did seemed to get through to her, and that terrified him more than he cared to admit. You're not walking away from this, he said again, his voice shaking. I'm going to make sure of that. But even as he said the words, he felt their hollowness. For the first time in his career, he wasn't sure what would happen next. For the first time, he didn't know if he had control over the situation. Lisa's silence, her unwavering calmness had thrown him completely off balance, and he didn't know how to regain control. The tension between them hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The street around them remained quiet, but the weight of their confrontation pressed down on Steve's chest like a heavy stone. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, his body preparing for something, anything to happen, but nothing did. Lisa remained still, her eyes locked onto his, her expression unreadable, and in that moment, Steve felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time: doubt. For the first time, he questioned himself, his motives, his actions, his role in this moment, and that doubt was more terrifying than anything else. Steve Hayes' breath came in ragged, shallow bursts now, the air between him and Lisa Collins feeling thick with an unspoken tension. His mind raced, churning with conflicting impulses. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to anyone standing up to him, especially not someone like her, someone who should be easy to break, easy to control. In an instant, something snapped inside him. He couldn't take it anymore, this feeling of being so powerless, of being stared down by a woman who was half his size and more than twice his age. He had to show her, had to make her understand that there was no escaping his authority, that there was no way she could win this game of silent defiance. Without thinking, his hand shot out, grabbing Lisa's thin arm, yanking her forward with more force than was necessary. Her body jerked toward him, and for a moment, he saw a flicker of pain cross her face, though she made no sound. The groceries in her hand shook, but she didn't drop them. Her cane wobbled, and she shifted her weight to keep from falling, her balance momentarily disrupted. You think you can just stand here and talk to me like that? Steve hissed, his face close to hers, his voice low and venomous, his grip on her arm tightening, his fingers digging into her skin. You think I'm going to let you walk away after disrespecting me? Lisa didn't say a word. Her eyes flicked down to where his hand gripped her arm, then back up to meet his gaze, calm and steady as ever. That look, how she refused to cower or react, fueled his rage further. He expected her to cry out, to apologize, to plead for him to let go, but she did none of those things. Let go of me, she said softly, her voice calm but firm. Steve's grip tightened further. He could feel her frail bones under his fingers, and something in the back of his mind told him to stop, to pull back before things got worse. But that part of him was quickly drowned out by the roar of his frustration. No, he spat, pulling her even closer. You don't get to tell me what to do. You're the one who's out here acting like you own the place. Well, guess what? You don't. I do. Is this really about me, Officer Hayes, or is this about you? Her words cut through him sharper than any physical blow. He felt a jolt of anger surge through his veins, his heart pounding in his ears. How dare she speak to him like that? How dare she try to psychoanalyze him as if she knew anything about him, or what he was going through? Shut up, he growled, his voice shaking with barely contained fury. You don't know anything about me. Her silence in response was deafening. It was as if she didn't need to say anything further, as if her gaze alone was enough to call out the weakness she saw in him, the uncertainty that simmered beneath the surface of his anger. She wasn't he afraid of him, she wasn't he afraid of his badge, his power, or his threats, and that terrified him. "I'm not going to ask you again," he said, his voice louder now, cracking slightly with the weight of his own uncertainty. "You either cooperate, or this is going to get a lot worse for you." Still, Lisa didn't move. She didn't pull away, didn't struggle, didn't raise her voice. Instead, she looked at him with those same calm, unblinking eyes and said, "You already lost control the moment you laid a hand on me." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. His mind raced, trying to process what she had said, but before he could fully register it, his body reacted. His free hand came up, and before he could stop himself, he threw a punch. It happened in a flash, a quick, sharp movement, his fist connecting with the side of her face. The impact was harder than he intended, and the force of it sent Lisa stumbling backward. Her cane clattered to the ground, her body twisting awkwardly as she tried to steady herself. Her grocery bag spilled open, cans rolling across the pavement, a loaf of bread landing in the gutter. Steve stood there frozen for a moment, his fists still clenched, his breath coming in harsh, uneven gasps. The sound of the punch seemed to echo in the stillness of the street, reverberating through his head. His heart pounded in his chest, blood rushing in his ears as the reality of what he had just done settled over him like a cold blanket. Lisa fell to one knee, her hand bracing against the ground as she slowly regained her balance. She didn't cry out, didn't scream or shout, she simply wiped a small trickle of blood from the corner of her mouth with the back of her hand and stood up shakily but determined. For a moment, Steve felt a surge of satisfaction, a sick sense of relief that he had finally broken her, that he had finally made her understand who was in charge. But that feeling vanished almost as quickly as it came when Lisa turned to face him again, her gaze still calm, still steady. But now there was something else in her eyes, something that made Steve's stomach twist with a cold, creeping sense of dread. It wasn't fear, it wasn't pain. It was disappointment. "You're going to regret that," she said quietly, her voice soft but carrying an undeniable weight. Steve felt a chill run down his spine. Something about the way she said those words with such certainty unsettled him in a way he hadn't expected. He opened his mouth to respond, to say something to regain control of the situation, but nothing came out. His throat felt tight, his tongue heavy. Suddenly, Lisa reached into her coat pocket. The movement was slow and deliberate, and Steve's instincts kicked in. His hand went to his gun, his fingers curling around the handle as he watched her every move. For a brief, terrifying moment, he thought she might be pulling out a weapon, something she had concealed all along, waiting for the right moment to strike back. But it wasn't a weapon she pulled from her pocket. It was something much worse. Lisa slowly held out a small black leather wallet and flipped it open with a practiced motion. Inside was a gleaming FBI badge, the gold and silver reflecting the dim light of the street lamp overhead. Steve's eyes widened, his breath catching in his throat as he stared at the badge in disbelief. His mind couldn't process what he was seeing. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat louder than the last. He tried to form words, to say something, anything, but his voice failed him. "I'm Special Agent Lisa Collins," she said softly, her voice carrying a tone of quiet authority that was far more intimidating than any shout or threat. "Undercover, and you, Officer Hayes, just made a very, very big mistake." Steve felt the world tilt around him, a nauseating wave of panic flooding his system. His hand dropped from his gun, hanging limp at his side as he stared at the badge, at the woman he had just assaulted, an FBI agent, undercover. The reality of what he had done crashed down on him like a tidal wave. His mind raced, scrambling for a way out, for some explanation or excuse that could undo the damage, but there was none. There was no way to take back the punch, no way to erase the fact that he had just assaulted a federal agent in broad view of the street. His entire career, everything he had worked for, was unraveling before his eyes. "Lisa,"